The focus on Epiphany Sunday is naturally on the three figures mentioned there. We don't really know if there were three. The Western church tradition assumed because of three gifts. Somewhere people decided because there were three gifts and they didn't share in the giving, each one gave something individually, that there were three of them. In the Eastern Christian tradition, the Orthodox churches like the Russian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, etc., they have the number at 12 of the wise men or the kings, or actually magicians, astrologers, not astronomers, but more to the magic side. They were probably from Persia or modern-day Iran, and probably priests or official figures, high-powered figures in that religion that was dominant in Zoroastrianism. Difficult name for a religion. And there's a lot of tradition and stories. It seems that the church was fascinated by these people. Generally, the meaning of the involvement of these figures from the East, Gentiles, not Jewish people, was taken by the Christian tradition to mean that this is the involvement of Gentiles in the life of Jesus, through which God showed that in baby Jesus, or toddler Jesus, because the tradition, the Western tradition, assumed for the largest part that they arrived about 2 years after the birth, and not shortly after the birth, but that these figures, through baby Jesus and the birth of Jesus, that it was shown that God was present in Jesus, that Jesus was God incarnate. So the three kings, or the three wise men or magicians, they are the main theme for Epiphany. And Amy explained what Epiphany means and what it's about in her children's sermon. But that's the focus for the Western church. The Eastern church, with their 12 guys that came from the East, they focus on the baptism of Jesus and says, through the baptism of Jesus and the Holy Spirit coming down, when Jesus was baptized, that is how God revealed that in Jesus, God is really present. And so forth and so forth. Many stories and traditions around these figures. They even have names. Caspar and Melchior and Balthazar. And if you start looking at the names, they are the derivatives, and different names in different traditions are just astounding. But let's stick with our Western church tradition, with their names. You all know the funny stories around them also, I suppose. One thing that I found that was interesting was the two rather mature women discussing, the birth stories in Epiphany. The one said to the other, that story of the virgin birth, I can take that. That's okay, but the story of the three wise men, that's a bit far-fetched. And then Jay Leno also had an interesting one. I don't know if you listened to him or saw that perhaps. That he said this past Christmas there were no nativity scenes in Washington, D.C. And it has nothing to do with the war on Christmas or anything religious. It was just that they couldn't find three wise men in all of Washington, D.C., and neither could they find a virgin there. And I was hesitant to mention the virgin part, but then I thought the Bible speaks about virgins, so I think I won't be crucified if I mention that as well. And the one that I think most people are familiar with is the story about that they were definitely men. Because if it was to be wise women, they would have asked directions. They would have arrived on time. They would have helped with the birth. They wouldn't have brought the nonsensical gifts, but practical stuff. They would have helped to clean the stable, and then they would have brought casseroles for the next week. Enough on that. In trying to prepare something for Epiphany, I ran into that which I think every preacher runs into when you have these important days on the church calendar. What is there to say? For instance, with Christmas Eve, what can you say? People know the story. If we are advanced enough in years, like some of us are experiencing, you can bargain that people won't remember what you said last year. And you can get away with telling the same story or having the same sermon. But with Epiphany, I was reading stuff and I said, yeah, okay, I think people knew that. And then I found something that I haven't run into before around Epiphany. And that has to do with chalk. And that's where the sermon title comes from, chalk on the doors. Has anybody encountered any tradition around Irina and Connie? Okay. Trust the Germans to know this stuff. Yeah, it's a European tradition, I think, and mainly in the UK, that I couldn't find a German connection yet, but I didn't have time to read far enough. But in the UK, it is apparently, and in Germany, as is evident, the tradition that either on Epiphany, the day itself, or on the eve of Epiphany, that people write on the doors of their dwellings. Depending on how religious you are, you can either ask the priest to do that with chalk that the priest has blessed, and then the priest come and do the inscription, or you can just get the chalk from the priest and do the writing yourself and so forth. But what is important is that people write on their doors or on the door frame. And they use the names of the three wise men and the first letter of those names, the Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. That's included in the inscription. In between those letters, there are crosses. Obvious the connection with Christianity and the cross. And then also the calendar year. In the beginning and at the end, the calendar year brackets the inscription. Like for this year, it will be 20 and then 19 at the end, with the letters and the crosses in between. The letters also symbolizes, or it is the first letter of a blessing in Latin. Christus mansionem benedictat. May Christ bless this dwelling. BCM. And that to me was an interesting tradition, that people write this on their doors, and in that way, similar to what we found in the book of Exodus when it is described how the blood of the lamb was painted onto the door frames, that was their protection against the death of the firstborn or evil. And in the same way, people experience, at least to an extent, God's presence and God's protection over the people who live in that dwelling. So the inhabitants of a house, let's say in Europe, and I don't know to what extent it is still done today.
By the Catholic Church.
Catholic Church, okay. Still today then, it is experienced as a good tradition, indicating God's presence, experiencing God's presence through that, and also experiencing God's protection as people enter into the new year. There is another tradition that has to do with chalk on the doors that I found when reading about this practice of chalking the door with a blessing. It was practiced mainly in Scotland in the 18th century, when landlords wanted to have the people living in their tenements that they owned to leave. They would take chalk, and interestingly enough, on Whit Sunday, which is what we call Pentecost, and then also on St. Martin's Day, nothing to do with me, but on St. Martin's Day, which is November the 11th, 40 days preceding either Whit Sunday or St. Martin's Day, they would write on the door, the landlord, that you have to vacate these premises, give them notice to leave their dwelling on either Whit Sunday, Pentecost, or on St. Martin's Day. Interestingly enough, that the church days were chosen for the day to give notice to people to be evicted. I think one can really prepare a powerful sermon on that, but I think it just had to do with the church being so dominant in society then, that life of society was organized around the life of the church. And Whit Sunday and St. Martin's Day in Scotland in the 18th century, apparently important days. But it did speak to me of church holidays being a day when people who did not own their own dwelling would experience existential crisis. That security of this is where I live would be taken away. Because if you didn't vacate the premises on either Whit Sunday or St. Martin's Day, you would be evicted after 6 days. That was the law. And it, in a sense, pains me that the church high days would be associated with creating existential crisis for those that are vulnerable. What does it have to do with us, this chalk on the doors, the inscription, "May Christ bless this dwelling"? And on Epiphany Sunday, a strange tradition maybe for us, I think we have a choice how we, as church and as Christians, go into this year. I think the choice is between being so firmly part of society and of the world that we are absorbed, as was the practice in Scotland, into society and dictated to by society, and where we totally lose our critical stance and our prophetic voice. And in the process sometimes become something, an entity, whether it is individual or as community, an existential threat and a harmful presence in the world. And let me be clear, I'm not saying all landlords are criminals or something to that extent. If you want to read it into it, it's not the case. Or we can practice with that inscription that may Christ bless this dwelling, may Christ bless this church and this community, may Christ bless the individual homes and the individuals associated with the family residing in that dwelling. But that for me is a bit self-centered, where we focus on God as the one to bless us. And we sit warmly and snugly together in the lovely sanctuary and ask God to bless us gathered here, us nice people, God's people. I would like for us to have inscribed, and not written with chalk, but more firmly inscribed in our hearts, our minds, our hands and our feet, our very being, that we understand that coming through the door, being part of this community, means that we are indeed God's people. And may we experience, when we gather, that this is indeed a place of healing and a place of life. And may we be committed enough and understand that firmly enough, that to be a place of, for this to be a place of healing and a place of life, that we have to live according to what Jesus taught us, that compassion should be at the heart of all that we are and all that we do, in this space and everywhere that we go. And may we have the inscription firmly in our hearts and minds and in our hands and feet as well, that when we enter here, that we also commit to being transformed by the Spirit of Christ continuously, and that we are committed to grow in God's love and in faith. And may it also be firmly inscribed on us, that when we leave here, we are faithfully committed to live according what we profess. That this table that we gathered around here, may that message of God's love go with us. And may we be a blessing so that the world that Jesus spoke about may indeed grow in us and grow through us. May that be our epiphany. May that be revealed to us every time that we enter through this door. Amen.